Take your Bibles open to Acts chapter 19. We're going to look at verses 31 through 41 as we conclude chapter 19 here this evening. We looked at last week, right here in the sanctuary in the evening service, and saw mention made of a man by the name of Demetrius. Who is Demetrius? Well, he was a silversmith. There was a goddess that was worshipped in Ephesus. Her name was Diana, which is her Roman name or Latin name. The Greek name was Artemis. And she was the goddess of fertility. And people in Ephesus worshipped her. They bowed before her. She had her own temple in the city of Ephesus. More on that in a little bit. But anyway, Demetrius was a silversmith who made little shrines, little statues, little images of Diana. And people would buy these and put them in their homes and bow before them and worship them, blatantly disregarding, ignoring, and sinning against the second commandment of God. Thou shalt not make any graven images of anything, any likeness of anything in heaven above, that's on the earth beneath, or in the water underneath the earth. Thou shalt not bow down to them nor serve them. So Demetrius not only was a silversmith, I'm going to stand here and say that he was also what I would call a demagogue. Do you know what a demagogue is? A demagogue is a person who will try to rally people together, not making any common sense, but politically motivated, may get people yelling and screaming for a cause that is really not important or what have you. And so he had people all rounded up, arguing and shouting about the fact that they were losing money. It says in Acts chapter 19, verse 26, he said, hey, let's look at Acts 19, verse 25. In the latter part of that verse, he said, sirs, you know that by this craft we have made our wealth. We have our wealth. He told the other servants who helped make these statues, we made a lot of money off of this little statue we're making for people. We're selling them like they're very, very popular. We're making a killing off of Diana. And he said, but, however, in verse 26 of 19, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods which are made with hands. True. Paul said anything made with hands is not a true God. John chapter 4, I think it's verse 23, says God is his spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. God is not a thing that we can tangibly touch, that we can visually see. No, God is a spirit. And so not only was Demetrius a demagogue, but he also is an agitator. That'd be the definition of a demagogue. He was a rabble-rouser. Just in simple terms, he was a troublemaker. That's whom and what Demetrius was. So people got so riled up, so angry, that they gathered together in an amphitheater there in Ephesus that held about 20,000 people when it was at full capacity. I brought out last Sunday night and said that in these amphitheaters there, they would take Christians and persecute them and wrap them in animal skins that a wolf or a dog, a mean dog or a lion could smell, and then they'd throw you into the arena and people would be cheering like it was a football game or something like that as they're watching Christians being devoured by wild animals. That wasn't the case here, though, with Paul. In the case here with Paul, the people had congregated into the amphitheater because they were upset, very upset, that Paul is disturbing their money-making business of these little statues. And Demetrius is the one that got all of this started. So we found in chapter 19, verse 30, in the latter part, Paul was ready to go inside that amphitheater and address the people, because Paul was not afraid to be persecuted. He was not afraid to be fed to a lion or a wild dog, if it be that. Paul was willing to go and had anticipating being allowed to go, but it says in chapter 19, verse 30, that his disciples suffered him not. The word suffered means allowed. So the disciples would not allow Paul to go into that amphitheater. Now then, we pick up with verse 31. It says, certain of the chief of Asia. Who were the chief of Asia? There were Roman provinces throughout the known world. And in every Roman province, there, particularly in Asia, where there were several cities and provinces of Rome and Asia, the Roman government would appoint 10 men. They were called asiarchs, and they would appoint these men to oversee anything that had to do with religion or sporting, athletic events. Being it was an amphitheater, which is an outdoor stadium, very similar to like a football stadium that we may see a ball game at in this day and age. It was similar to that. So these asiarchs were very involved with things that took place in that amphitheater. But thank goodness they were friends with Paul. Paul knew them and they knew Paul. It says, and certain of the chief of Asia, or these asiarchs, they were Paul's friends. They sent unto him, desiring also, like his disciples, they desired him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Why was it so important for Paul not to go inside this theater? Because they knew he was a man of God, gifted by God, and God needed him to be out there carrying his ministry into these Gentile lands, and they knew that God wasn't done with Paul and that he would be massacred. He would be literally obliterated. He'd be killed if he went inside that theater. So then let's go inside that theater and look at the people. You know what? We are seeing on college campuses all across our country, young students, even Ivy League campuses that are like 18, 19, 20 years old, 21, and they're rallying against certain things, and rallying for certain causes, all politically motivated. And I was watching a news show one time as a news person went up to a young college student on an Ivy League campus. I don't know. Maybe it was Yale, maybe it was Harvard, maybe it was Princeton. I don't know where it was. Went up to the student and said, do you know why you're here and why you're yelling? And the student said, I have no idea. But everyone else is doing it. I don't know what's going on, don't know why I'm here. And that's the situation it was in this amphitheater. So let's look at it. It says in verse 32, some therefore cried one thing, some another. Confusion is the word. For the assembly, or the ecclesia, which means assembly, a gathering of people, was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they would come together. Most of the people, in other words, translation, most people didn't even know why they were in that theater hollering for. They didn't know what's going on. And that's very similar. It made me think of the way it is today. And so then they go to verse 33. It says, while all this noise is going on, all this loud commotion was happening inside the theater, it says they drew Alexander. First of all, who are they and who is Alexander? They were Jewish leaders. Not only were there Gentiles in the city of Ephesus, there were Jews everywhere. And the Jewish religious leaders were always strongly against Paul and his preaching of Jesus. They were always against anything to do with the Lord, as they even tried themselves to be the ones that have him put on the cross. And ultimately, we could lay blame upon the religious leaders for having him nailed to that cross, but it was our sins that put him there. But anyway, the religious leaders were always against anything to do with Jesus. And so, therefore, and the religious leaders, which were the Sanhedrin and which was the scribes and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all. But anyway, they were always against Jesus, but they also were afraid of the Romans. The Romans led the known world at that time, and they had all these Roman provinces in the known world, and the Romans were in control, and the Jewish leaders were leading at the allowance of the Romans, and they figured that if there's any kind of rebellion or revolt, in fact, they were directly told that by the Romans, that if there's ever a revolt or a rebellion, they'd be in a bunch of trouble. They'd be in a bunch of trouble. So the religious leaders wanted everything to calm down. So they pushed forward one of their own. His name was Alexander. Who is Alexander? I don't know. I just know that he was a Jewish religious leader, and he is the one that they pushed forward. It says they drew Alexander, verse 33, out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward, and Alexander beckoned with his hand. What does that mean, to beckon with his hand? It means like, hold on now. This is what it means to beckon with a hand. Quieten down, calm down. And then he would have made a defense unto the people. See, he didn't want the Jewish religious leaders to be held accountable for this revolt, for this rebellion, for this loud cry of the people. He did not want the Jewish leaders to be responsible or accused of being responsible. So he said, hold on now. And before he could give defense of the Jewish religious leaders and say, we have nothing to do with this. This man preaches about Jesus, of whom we reject. Now, before he could say anything, it says they knew that he was a Jew. How did they know? Probably the way he dressed. He might have been a Pharisee or something, and it was a clear giveaway. So they knew that he was a Jewish man, and they were not going to hear of it. They were not going to hear anything that he had to say. So verse 34 says, when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice about the space of 2 hours cried out, great is Diana of the Ephesians. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Great is Diana of the Ephesians. How would it be if all of us shouted, great is Diana of the Ephesians, with one voice all together for 2 hours? Boy, I believe we'd all leave with a big, huge headache, wouldn't we? We'd be miserable. We'd be miserable, absolutely miserable. And that's the way it was. They were the people in the stands. They were not shouting, go Clemson, or go South Carolina, or go Georgia. No, they were in the stands crying out, great is Diana of the Ephesians, nonstop, over and over and over. This was a revolt, a riot, a rebellion, an insurrection that was beginning to take place among this big crowd. So we see someone else come into the picture. Who might it be? Says it was a town clerk, but it was actually the mayor of Ephesus. That's just a name that was given in the King James wording, but it is the mayor. And so verse 35 says, the mayor or the town clerk had appeased the people. How do you appease a crowd of people that are out of control? Got to be someone that's a slick, smooth-talking politician to be able to do something like that. So the mayor was a politician. And I guess he used some of his oratory skills to be able to shout out and tell the people, calm down, calm down. He said, ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how the city of Ephesians is a worshiper of the great goddess Diana? Now let me explain that. In Asia, there were at least 13 to 15 cities. Some of those cities in Asia included Philadelphia, Laodicea, Colossae, Ephesus, Smyrna, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, and Tarsus, which is the home city of Paul, by the way. So these were cities in Asia. And of all those cities, Ephesus was chosen by the Roman government to be a temple guardian of Diana or Artemis, meaning that they would construct the temple in Ephesus and they'd build her statue in Ephesus. And so Ephesus, they considered it an honor, an absolute honor as a city to be able to be declared the temple guardian of Diana. They worshiped Diana. It was sort of, I guess, kind of like the central headquarters of the world for Diana worship. And so the mayor of Ephesus stands up, and Alexander couldn't calm them down. They found out he's a Jew, so they just continued to get way out of control. So the mayor stands up, and they looked at him as perhaps he's a man of respect. They respected him. They listened to him. He said, calm down. All of you who are here, you know that our city was chosen to be the guardian city of the statue and the temple of Diana. The great goddess Diana is what he called them. And not only that, he identified this goddess, the statue that was inside the temple was a statue that had come, they believed, from Jupiter. That was their story. That's what they taught. That was their thing. They said that this goddess came from the planet Jupiter, and it was believed to have been more just like a meteorite. A meteorite is usually about 95% rock and rest maybe iron or something, and it would come from out of space and landed on the ground, and from that they carved out this goddess Diana and put her in the temple, and the people worshiped it. So he called her the great goddess of Diana, which fell down from Jupiter. Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against. In other words, the mayor said to the people in the Colosseum or in the amphitheater, seeing that this is an undeniable fact, an undeniable truth. What was undeniable? The fact that they were chosen to be the guardian city of Diana. So he says, seeing that these things cannot be spoken against, there in verse 36, you ought to be quiet and to do nothing rashly. That's good advice for all of us in everything, to be quiet and not act in haste and not be rash in anything. But this is what the mayor told the people. So they began to calm down somewhat. He said, look at these two men that you brought in here. What two men? Verse 29. Let's look at that. In Acts chapter 19, verse 29, it says, they brought in, the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. So Paul wanted to go in there. Perhaps he wanted to go in there and try to save his two friends, Gaius and Aristarchus. He wanted to address the people, but the disciples and the Asiarchs wouldn't let him go in for fear of his life. But they had poor Aristarchus and Gaius in there. And so the mayor calms the people of Ephesus down that were in that amphitheater, in that crowd. He said, for you have brought hither these two men. And he said, you know what? Look at them. Of these two men, they're not robbers of churches. They hadn't done anything. They're innocent people. They're good men. They hadn't done anything. They've not robbed any churches, and they have not been blasphemers of your goddess. They have not blasphemed Diana. They hadn't robbed churches. What have they done? Why are they scapegoats? Why are you punishing them? Why are you bringing them in as a public spectacle before the people? Why? He goes on and says in verse 38, wherefore if Demetrius, remember Demetrius, the one, the troublemaker, that said we've made a killing off of these statues, the silversmith, and said now we're losing money because people are turning away from Diana and they're worshiping this Christ Jesus that this man Paul keeps preaching about. So they said, wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which were with him, if they have a matter or a case against Paul or any man, then the law is open, or the courts are open, the courts are in session. And there are deputies or officials in the courts. Let them then plead. The word plead means sue. Let them sue one another if they have a legitimate, honest case. And if you inquire anything concerning other matters, shall be determined in a lawful assembly. So the mayor says, look, you're gathered around like a kangaroo court. You ever known where the term kangaroo court came from? In frontier courts of years ago, the judge would hop around from one city to another city like a kangaroo. And that's where kangaroo courts came from. And they were unlawful and they were not fair. Well, that's where the term kangaroo court came from. And that's pretty much what was going on in that stadium as they were ready to really have these people persecuted and killed or what have you. And so the mayor says, if Demetrius has a case and he can sue Paul for hurting his business, so be it. The courts are open. Go to them, to a lawful assembly. He said, but what's going on here? The mayor is talking with common sense somewhat here. He said, but what's going on with all the ruckus and all the noise and all the loudness going on inside the stadium? He said, we're in danger. Danger of what? Look at verse 40. He said, we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar. Meaning that noise of that crowd shouting, great is the goddess Diana, great is the goddess Diana, great is the goddess Diana, over and over and over. It had to be very boisterously loud, very much loud. And so them doing that, word got to the Romans more than likely, or would if it hadn't already. And the Romans, they frowned upon and did not like any kind of rebellion. They wanted to be in control, and they didn't want any kind of a revolt, any kind of an insurrection. And so by them doing that, the mayor said, we're in danger of this being declared a revolt or rebellion, and the Romans hear about it. We're cooked. We're in big, big, big trouble. So calm down. The mayor said, calm down, people. Just calm down. He said, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. He said, if the Romans come to us, and we'll have no explanation, no legitimate, good, valid reason for why we're doing what we're doing here in this stadium. So, when he said this, he dismissed the assembly. He let them go. Now, the key verse of what I want us to look at here tonight, and I'm going to revisit, is verse 37. Go back and look at it with me as I close. For ye have brought hither these men, said the mayor, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. See, Paul was not preaching against the Ephesians. And Paul, I want you to understand what Paul was doing. He was not preaching to the people and saying, stop worshiping Diana or you will die lost and go to hell. He didn't do that. What he was doing was preaching Jesus. He just simply preached Jesus. Now there's a verse in the Bible, it's Ephesians 5:11. And in that verse, Paul wrote and said, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. So it's my responsibility to preach against sin. It is your responsibility to witness against sin, to speak out against sin that the Bible reveals to us is sin. It's our responsibility to do that. But you hear the old saying, hate the sin but love the sinner. People out there in the world, they ridicule us as the church and as Christians for saying that. And they say you don't truly love the sinner. you hate the sin, but you hate the sinner too. No, that is a true statement. We must learn to love the sinner, but hate the sin that they commit, and try to steer them away from that and show them there is an answer, and that's Jesus. See, what shall it profit a man if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? I like to use, if Jesus would allow me to do so, I like to use those same words and say, what shall it profit a man to preach or teach or speak out against all kinds of sin without giving an alternative to that sin and telling them about Jesus? It's one thing to speak out against it, but another thing to tell people about Jesus, who is the remedy. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 1:23, I preach Christ and him crucified. In Romans 1:16, he said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, the Jew first and then also to the Greek. So that's what we got to do, folks. We need to speak out against the unfruitful works of darkness. Now notice that verse said, the unfruitful have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. Did not say we cannot be friends with sinners. We work with them. We live next to them. We're related to them. We know them. We can still be friends with them, but we're to reprove the works of darkness. People in darkness, we can love them, and we can encourage them, pray for them, and try to do all we can do to reach them. But their works, the sins, no. Hate the sin, love the sinner. Preach the truth, which is Jesus. That's our lesson for tonight. Thank you for listening.